Moscow, December 1971. The air inside the Institute of Control Sciences carries the smell of burnt resistors and stale tobacco. In a basement room lit by fluorescent tubes, a young mathematician named Viktor Glushkov stares at a wall-sized schematic of the Soviet economy rendered in colored chalk. 247 industrial sectors, 18,000 enterprises, 49 million products, all connected by lines representing material flows, energy dependencies, labor allocations. He's been awake for 36 hours. His hand trembles as he draws one final arrow connecting steel production in Magnitogorsk to tractor assembly in Volgograd. He steps back. The diagram looks like a neural network. It looks like a machine. It looks, he thinks, like something that could finally be controlled. Here's the paradox that will consume the next 2 decades. A brilliant scientist with access to the world's most powerful computers tried to prove that central planning could outperform markets through pure mathematics, and the harder he worked, the faster the system collapsed. This is the story of how the Soviet Union tried to replace human decision-making with equations, and why the attempt didn't just fail. It revealed a mathematical law that destroyed the ideological foundation of communism itself. In a mahogany-paneled conference room 3 floors above Glushkov's basement, Deputy Minister Nikolai Baibakov listens to the proposal with arms crossed. Glushkov stands at a podium, flanked by 2 colleagues from the Academy of Sciences. The presentation has been rehearsed for weeks. Glushkov speaks with the controlled passion of a man who believes he's holding the key to history. Comrade Minister, the capitalist economy is chaos. Millions of independent decisions, all contradicting each other. We waste resources on advertising, on competition, on redundancy, but we have something they don't: unity of purpose and centralized information. With the OGAS network, we can optimize the entire economy in real time. Every factory, every warehouse, every transport link connected to a single computational center. We calculate optimal production. We eliminate waste. We prove, mathematically, that socialism is superior. Baibakov lights a cigarette. The silence stretches. Then he laughs, not cruelly, but with the weary amusement of a man who has heard 100 ambitious proposals from scientists who've never managed a factory. Comrade Glushkov, I ran the oil industry for 12 years. Do you know how many variables affect the output of a single refinery? Temperature, pressure, catalyst quality, crude composition, equipment age, worker skill, spare parts availability, transport schedules, downstream demand. And that's one facility. You want to optimize 50,000 facilities simultaneously. Yes, Comrade Minister, that's exactly what I want to do. Baibakov exhales smoke toward the ceiling. The Politburo will be very interested. Prepare a full technical specification. The meeting ends. Glushkov walks back to his basement with the authorization letter that will change his life. He doesn't see the look Baibakov exchanges with his deputy, a look that says, let the mathematician play with his equations. The real economy will continue as it always has. Before we go further into what Glushkov built, understand why this matters to you. This isn't just Soviet history. Every time someone proposes that artificial intelligence can manage an economy, that algorithms can replace markets, that central planning just needs better computers, they're repeating Glushkov's experiment. And they're going to hit the same mathematical wall. If you want to understand why certain problems can't be solved by throwing more computing power at them, stay with this story. The lesson Glushkov learned cost the Soviet Union billions of rubles and 2 decades of economic stagnation. You can learn it in the next 20 minutes. The project that became OGAS, the All-State Automated System, began with a simple observation. In 1962, Glushkov had visited the SAGE air defense network in the United States as part of a technical exchange. He saw rooms full of computers coordinating radar stations across an entire continent. Real-time data flowing through telephone lines, centralized control responding to threats in seconds. He returned to Moscow with a conviction. If Americans could network computers to defend against bombers, Soviets could network computers to manage an economy. The mathematics seemed sound. Leonid Kantorovich had already won the Lenin Prize for linear programming, a method for optimizing resource allocation under constraints. You could express any economic problem as a system of equations. Maximize output, minimize cost, subject to constraints of labor, materials, energy, transport capacity. Solve the equations, execute the solution. The economy becomes a vast optimization problem, and the Soviet Union had the world's best mathematicians. Glushkov assembled a team: mathematicians from Moscow State University, engineers from the Ministry of Instrument Making, economists from Gosplan, the central planning agency. They worked in shifts around the clock, designing the architecture of a system that would connect every significant economic unit in the Soviet Union to a hierarchy of computing centers. Regional centers would collect data from factories and farms. Republic-level centers would aggregate and process. The apex in Moscow would compute the optimal plan and transmit instructions back down the hierarchy. The technical specifications filled 3 volumes, 20,000 computer terminals, 300,000 kilometers of dedicated communication lines, a central computing facility in Moscow with processing power equivalent to 10,000 human planners working simultaneously. Cost estimate: 20 billion rubles over 15 years. For comparison, the entire Soviet space program cost 18 billion rubles. The Politburo approved a pilot program in 1970. Start with one industrial sector, prove the concept, then scale. Glushkov chose the textile industry. 42 major factories, 6 synthetic fiber plants, 18,000 product variations. A relatively simple sector, he thought. Manageable complexity. The first problem appeared within 3 months. The system required each factory to report daily production figures, inventory levels, equipment status, labor availability, and material requirements. The reports came in on standardized forms, transmitted via telegraph to a processing center in Kiev. The center would input the data into a BESM6 computer, run the optimization algorithms, and transmit production instructions back to the factories. In theory, this should have taken 4 hours per cycle. In practice, the telegraph operators at the factories didn't understand the forms. They made transcription errors, they rounded numbers, they skipped fields they considered unimportant. The data arrived at Kiev corrupted. The computer rejected 30% of inputs as invalid. The programmers had to call the factories to verify figures. The factories didn't answer because the engineers were on the production floor, not in offices. By the time clean data was assembled, 12 hours had passed. The optimization algorithm took 6 hours to run on the BESM6. By the time instructions reached the factories, the situation had changed. Machines had broken down, shipments had been delayed, workers had been reassigned. The factories ignored the computer's instructions and followed their own judgment. Glushkov's team identified the problem: insufficient data quality and processing speed. The solution seemed obvious: better training for operators, faster computers, more reliable communication lines. They requested funding for an upgraded system. The Ministry of Finance approved half the requested amount. The upgraded system went live in January 1972. New operators, trained for 3 weeks. Faster telegraph equipment. A more powerful computer, the BESM-10, fresh from the Lebedev Institute. The optimization algorithm was rewritten to run in 4 hours instead of 6. The second problem appeared within 2 weeks. The algorithm optimized for total output value. It calculated that the most profitable product mix was 70% synthetic fabrics, 30% cotton blends. It issued instructions accordingly. The factories retooled their lines. Production of synthetic fabrics increased by 40% in 1 month. Then the warehouses filled up. Nobody wanted synthetic fabrics. Consumers preferred cotton. Retail stores refused to stock the synthetic products. The warehouses in 6 cities overflowed. The factories had no place to send output. Production stopped. Workers sat idle. The computer, asked to optimize again with the new constraint, warehouse capacity, calculated that the factories should shut down synthetic lines and return to cotton production. Retooling again took 3 weeks. By the time cotton production resumed, the spring season had passed. Demand had shifted to lighter summer fabrics. The system was always optimizing for yesterday's reality. Glushkov saw the pattern. The problem wasn't data quality or processing speed. The problem was time. The economy changed faster than the system could respond. By the time you gathered data, computed the optimum, and implemented the plan, the optimum had moved. He wrote a memo to the Academy of Sciences. We need real-time data collection and processing. The optimization cycle must complete in under 1 hour. The Academy responded, the technology does not exist. This is where most accounts of Ogaz stop, with a story about technological limitations. But that's not where the story ends, because Glushkov didn't give up. He did something remarkable. He went back to the mathematics and asked a deeper question. What if the problem isn't the speed of computers, but the nature of optimization itself? In 1973, Glushkov published a paper that received almost no attention outside a small circle of mathematicians. The title was dry, On the Computational Complexity of Economic Planning Problems. The content was explosive. He proved that for an economy with N products and M enterprises, the number of calculations required to compute the true optimum grows exponentially with N times M. Not linearly, not polynomially, exponentially. For the Soviet economy, 49 million products, 18,000 enterprises, the number of calculations required exceeded the number of atoms in the observable universe. No computer that could physically exist would ever be fast enough. But Glushkov didn't publish this as a defeat. He published it as a challenge to his own assumptions. If exact optimization is impossible, what about approximate optimization? What if you don't need the perfect plan, just a good enough plan? He spent the next 2 years developing heuristic algorithms, methods that find decent solutions quickly instead of perfect solutions never. The mathematics was elegant, the algorithms ran fast. In simulations, they produced plans that were 85% as efficient as the theoretical optimum in 1,000th the time. The Academy was impressed. Funding was restored. A new pilot program launched in 1975, this time in the machine tool industry. 30 factories, 12,000 products. The heuristic system computed plans in 45 minutes. The plans looked reasonable. The factories implemented them. The third problem appeared within 6 months. The heuristic algorithm optimized locally, each factory's output, but it couldn't see the global interactions. A machine tool factory in Sverdlovsk would receive instructions to increase production of a particular lathe model. It would order more steel from a supplier in Chelyabinsk. The steel mill would reduce shipments to a ball-bearing factory in Saratov to meet the new demand. The ball-bearing factory would cut production. A tractor plant in Volgograd that depended on those bearings would halt its assembly line. The tractor halt would cascade to collective farms that needed new equipment. Grain production would fall. The bread supply in 3 cities would tighten. None of this was visible to the optimization algorithm because it only looked 1 step ahead. The system was creating shortages faster than it was solving them. Glushkov saw it happening in the data: inventory oscillations, cascading delays, bullwhip effects rippling through supply chains. He recognized the pattern from control theory. The system was unstable. Each correction created a larger disturbance downstream. He wrote another paper, This one never published. The economy is not a machine. It is a network of semi-autonomous agents making local decisions with incomplete information. Centralized optimization assumes you can see the whole network and control all the agents. But the act of collecting information changes the network. The act of issuing instructions changes the agent's behavior. You are not optimizing a static system. You are trying to control a system that reacts to your control. This is the insight that broke him. In the West, this problem had a name: the calculation debate. Ludwig von Mises had argued in 1920 that socialist calculation was impossible because central planners could never have enough information to set prices correctly. Friedrich Hayek had extended the argument in 1945. The information needed to run an economy is dispersed, local, tacit, and constantly changing. Markets work not because they optimize globally, but because they allow millions of local optimizations to proceed in parallel, coordinated by price signals. Glushkov had never read Mises or Hayek. Their works were not available in the Soviet Union. He had discovered the same principle through mathematics, but he was a loyal Soviet scientist. He couldn't publish a proof that central planning was mathematically impossible. Instead, he did something more subtle. He began advocating for what he called optimal planning with market elements. Let the computer handle large-scale coordination, energy, transport, heavy industry. But let individual enterprises make local decisions about product mix, pricing, and supply relationships. Use profit as a feedback signal. Allow competition between enterprises. In other words, introduce markets. The proposal reached the IG Politburo in 1978. The response was immediate and unambiguous. Glushkov was removed from the OGAS project. The official reason: Comrade Glushkov has made valuable contributions, but the project requires new leadership to enter its implementation phase. The real reason, conveyed in a private meeting with a Central Committee member: you are proposing to dismantle socialism in the name of efficiency. This is ideologically unacceptable. The OGAS project continued without him, now led by engineers who understood that their job was not to solve the problem, but to create the appearance of progress. Computers were installed in factories, data was collected, reports were generated. But the reports were never used for actual planning. Gosplan continued to set production targets the same way it always had, through political negotiation between ministries, adjusted by informal relationships and barter deals between factory managers. The computers became expensive typewriters. Glushkov returned to pure mathematics. He published papers on abstract algebra and automata theory. He never spoke publicly about OGAS again. In 1982, he died of a heart attack at age 58. The obituary in Pravda praised his contributions to cybernetics and control theory. It did not mention OGAS. But the story doesn't end with Glushkov's death, because the same mathematical wall he hit was about to be hit by the entire Soviet economy. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary. He inherited an economy that was stagnating despite vast natural resources and an educated workforce. Growth had slowed to near zero. Shortages were endemic. Technology lagged a generation behind the West. He launched two reforms: glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. Perestroika was supposed to revitalize socialism by making it more efficient. The plan was to give enterprises more autonomy, allow some market pricing, reduce central control. In other words, exactly what Glushkov had proposed 7 years earlier. But Gorbachev's economists made a fatal assumption that you could have partial markets, that you could introduce competition in some sectors while maintaining central planning in others, that you could allow prices to float within limits while still controlling production targets. The mathematics Glushkov had discovered said this was impossible. Here's why. In a planned economy, every price is wrong because prices are set by planners, not by supply and demand. But the wrongness is consistent. If steel is underpriced and bread is overpriced, everyone knows it and everyone adjusts their behavior accordingly. The system is inefficient, but it's stable. When you introduce partial markets, some prices become right and some stay wrong. Steel might now be priced correctly, but electricity is still controlled. A factory that uses both inputs can't optimize because it's operating in two different economic realities simultaneously. The inconsistency creates arbitrage opportunities. People start gaming the system, buying underpriced controlled goods and selling them at market prices. The planners respond by tightening controls. The markets respond by creating black markets. The system oscillates between chaos and repression. This is exactly what happened between 1987 and 1991. Gorbachev's reforms created an economy that was neither planned nor market-based. It was incoherent. Factories couldn't plan because they didn't know which prices were real. Consumers couldn't budget because shortages appeared randomly. The government couldn't control inflation because the money supply was expanding to cover enterprise losses while prices were supposedly floating. The Soviet economy didn't collapse because of external pressure. It collapsed because it tried to be two incompatible things at once, and the mathematical contradictions tore it apart. On December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. The red flag came down from the Kremlin. 15 republics became independent states. The 74-year experiment in scientific socialism ended. In the archives of the Institute of Control Sciences, Glushkov's papers remained in a locked filing cabinet. In 1995, a young Russian economist named Yegor Gaidar, who had led the transition to a market economy, visited the institute. He asked to see Glushkov's unpublished work on OGAS. He spent 3 days reading. When he emerged, he told the director, "If we had read this in 1985, we might have understood what we were about to do wrong." The director asked, would it have changed anything? Gaidar thought for a long time. No, the politics required us to try, but we would have failed faster and with less suffering. Now let's return to that conference room in 1971, where Deputy Minister Baibakov laughed at Glushkov's proposal to optimize the entire Soviet economy with computers. Baibakov was right to laugh, but for the wrong reason. He thought the problem was practical. Too many variables, too much complexity. He thought better computers might eventually solve it. The truth Glushkov discovered was deeper. The problem was mathematical, not technological, not organizational, mathematical. You cannot centrally plan a complex economy because the information required to compute the optimal plan does not exist in any one place at any one time. It is distributed across millions of minds, embedded in local knowledge, changing every second. By the time you collect it, it's obsolete. By the time you compute the plan, reality has shifted. By the time you implement the plan, you're optimizing for a world that no longer exists. Markets work not because they're optimal, but because they're parallel. Millions of people making local decisions with local information, coordinated by prices that aggregate everyone's knowledge in real time. No central computer, no master plan, just signals and responses, errors and corrections, all happening simultaneously. Glushkov proved this mathematically. He proved that the dream of scientific socialism, that human society could be managed like a machine, optimized like an equation, was impossible in principle, not just in practice. And he proved it using the tools of Soviet science, in the heart of the Soviet system, while trying to make that system work. The irony is perfect. A loyal communist scientist set out to demonstrate the superiority of central planning and ended up discovering a mathematical law that destroyed the theoretical foundation of communism. This is why the story matters beyond Cold War history. Because the dream doesn't die. Every few years, someone proposes that artificial intelligence can now do what Soviet computers couldn't. That machine learning can find patterns humans miss. That big data can capture the information that eluded Gosplan. That algorithmic management can optimize what markets leave to chance. And every time, they're wrong for the same reason Glushkov was wrong. The problem isn't the power of the computer. The problem is the nature of the information. Economic information is not data waiting to be collected. It is knowledge created by the act of decision-making. It exists in the moment of choice. You cannot gather it without changing it. You cannot centralize it without destroying it. Hayek called this the knowledge problem. Glushkov called it computational irreducibility. The names differ. The mathematics is the same. A complex adaptive system cannot be optimized from outside because the optimizer is part of the system. Your attempt to control changes what you're trying to control. Your model of the economy becomes an input to the economy, which changes the economy, which invalidates your model. You're trying to compute a function that includes your own computation as a variable. This is not a technological limitation. This is a logical impossibility, like trying to write a program that predicts its own output before running. Glushkov understood this by 1978. The Soviet leadership never did. They kept trying to plan the unplannable, optimize the unoptimizable, control the uncontrollable, and the harder they tried, the faster the system degraded. The final irony, the Soviet Union had the mathematicians, the computers, the resources, and the political will to attempt the greatest optimization project in human history. They had everything except the one thing that mattered, a problem that could be solved by optimization. In the basement of the Institute of Control Sciences, the wall-sized diagram of the Soviet economy remained on the chalkboard for years after Glushkov left. Cleaning staff were instructed not to erase it. Visitors would come to see it. This beautiful, intricate map of an economy rendered as a machine. In 1991, after the Soviet Union dissolved, someone finally wiped it clean. The chalk dust hung in the air for a moment, catching the fluorescent light, then settled on the floor. 247 industrial sectors, 18,000 enterprises, 49 million products, all connected by lines that represented flows that never flowed as planned, dependencies that never held, optimizations that never optimized. It had been beautiful, it had been rigorous, it had been mathematically sophisticated, and it had been impossible from the start. Glushkov knew, he proved it, and the system destroyed him for telling the truth. That's the story of how a scientist tried to prove communism with mathematics and failed not because the mathematics was wrong, but because it was right.